Again, welcome everybody. I'm Carla Slocum. I'm the co-chair of the Black Communities Conference, along with Mark Little, who you'll see at this afternoon's roundtable, as well as some of the collab sessions and other events this week. Welcome back to the second week and the first panel of the second week. I'm really glad that you've joined us. I'm glad to be able to have this discussion today. This is the session that is about lawn signs and statements in the related to the Black Lives Matter movement, and we wanted to be able to just have a discussion about that today with three fabulous panelists. We have for this discussion today Rosalind Woodward-Pels, who is Vice President of Repairers of the Breach, which is an organization, a nonpartisan organization seeking to build a progressive agenda and movement. We also have Marcia Chatelain, who is Professor of History and African American Studies at Georgetown University. And we have Bianca Williams, who is Associate Professor of Anthropology and Gender Studies and Critical Psychology at CUNY Grad Center in New York. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the panelists. So the format that this will follow is I'll ask some questions. I'll start with an initial question and ask each person to respond, and then we'll just let the conversation unfold. We have a few questions that we want to dig into. If you would like to help structure some of our questions, you're welcome to add things to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will be looking there throughout the session to be able to respond to some of the questions that come in. Based on what we saw last week, I will just let you know ahead of time that we're unlikely to be able to get to every question that we receive. Unfortunately, the time just doesn't allow, but we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. So without further ado, because the time is short, let's jump right in. Well, everybody, so we're here again to talk about this question of all these Black Lives Matter statements that have emerged in large number ever since the summer, after George Floyd's murder and the subsequent Black Lives Matter protests. So we're all familiar with those statements that we've seen, especially on suburban lawns, and the statements from various corporations and the street murals and all different sorts of ways that we've seen these declarations that Black Lives Matter, even though the movement, of course, has been around for much longer. So given that, what should we make of the emergence of these signs and statements? And what do they mean as a response to the events that we saw in the summer, George Floyd's murder and the protests? And what impact do you think they have? Marcia, I want to start with you.
Thank you so much, Carla. And it's great to be here at this gathering to think about Black communities broadly. I recently wrote a book about McDonald's in Black America. And this summer, McDonald's took it upon itself to tweet Black Lives Matter, which I thought was hilarious because when we think about the ways that so many organizations have been trying to fight for living wages, the constant concern about personal protective equipment for fast food workers, the various ways that the fast food industry not only exploits the people working in the stores, but the supply chain that fuels it. There's something really fascinating that a major corporation like McDonald's is saying Black Lives Matter. So how do we get to that, inflection point? And what I think we saw this summer was really a reflection not just about the tragedy of George Floyd, because that was not the first time that had happened. What we saw was people being placed in a context where, because of the excesses of the Trump administration in action and rhetoric, people had a clear sense that they had to place themselves in history. And so no other time have we had the ability for everyday people to create an archive of who they are in a significant moment in history, right? Like everyone, by virtue of having a smartphone, having any type of online access, can put a stamp on who they were in 2020. And I think that there's a growing consciousness of not wanting to run afoul of historians in the future who said, in 2021, this person didn't understand that Black Lives Matter. They didn't understand that this was wrong. So I think what we're seeing is people writing themselves into a narrative about the present that they feel is important, because I think there's also an understanding that the rise of Trump was because of all of the unchecked excesses of the past. And so while I never want to diminish someone's desire to come closer to movement, I think this is also about a kind of self-fashioning that is probably evidence in the fact that a lot of people put up signs but they really didn't explore the kind of structural ways that they exacerbate the problem of racism in their choices, big and small.
Okay, thank you. Roz, what are your thoughts on this question? You're muted. Do you want to unmute yourself? Happens to all of us.
So I'm also happy to be on this panel and looking forward to this conversation. I think I love, Marcia, what you said, because it really is a lot of, it reflects how I'm thinking about this. These signs are everywhere, these statements are everywhere, and they are important. They reflect kind of a new understanding on the part of some people. It promotes consciousness and awareness. It starts discussions in places where they might not have happened in the past. And so they are important. And the point you're making about it also puts people in this historic context that we're in is also important. The whole notion about Black Lives Matter really finds its birth and origin in the murders of Black men and women in this country. And of course, those murders are not new, but it was a kind of a clarion call that put us all together. But for many of us who have the signs, it was that 8 minutes, but it was years. It was 8 years. It was 16 years. It was 400 years that came together at one point in history and forced us all to say no more. And some of us put up signs and some of us did other things. And I have to be clear, the signs are not enough. And I hope we can come back to this whole question of corporations because, and I'm really so happy you mentioned McDonald's. I advised the Poor People's Campaign in the country. And so we've taken up this campaign. We're with Amazon workers today at our Moral Mondays. So I'd love to come back to talk about that. But I think, again, these signs and statements are important. They are not enough. And there should be a lot of skepticism in some places where they appear.
Okay, thanks. And Bianca.
I won't add a ton because I think Marcia and Ms. Rosalind have said pretty much what I would say. The only thing I would add is I like to follow the money for me, especially when it comes to corporations. So I kind of read the individual signage like on people's homes, in their home space and in their community spaces a bit different in the sense that being in Brooklyn in the middle of COVID, in the middle of the protests of last summer, after years of organizing with the Denver chapter of BLM, I was both like confused and skeptical, but also maybe hesitantly optimistic about what I was seeing in my community because I'm seeing droves of white folks in the streets organizing or at least having some type of activism and yelling and screaming around Black Lives Matter was like this kind of moment, like something has shifted in the last 5 years, because in 2015, this was not, even in Denver, which is a majority white community city, I was not seeing the droves of white folks screaming Black Lives Matter as I was in Brooklyn. But history has made me skeptical, right? And so in that moment, I was like, what is actually happening? And I think some of the self-fashioning that Marcia talks about probably was also at play. But it was encouraging to see that there was mass movement, or at least mass thinking happening around this. And I read the signs as somewhat a victory in the sense that we had made this a mainstream conversation, a national conversation. I mean, talking about abolition in the news on like the mainstream news, and it was like we weren't talking about it and suddenly it showed up out of nowhere. So for me, that was a victory. But speaking to the corporate statements, higher ed institutions, corporations like Walmart and McDonald's, that I probably read with a severe amount of skepticism, just because for me, the money is what is important. And so I wanted to follow where the money was going, or if corporations were beginning to fundraise and really direct money to initiatives that were driven by the folks who were either in the streets or the folks who have been doing this work for forever. And so for me, like, I'm not going to believe Walmart or McDonald's or any of the higher ed institutions until I see where the money is investing in initiatives and programming and structural change that actually allows Black people to live and survive.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you brought up the skepticism, because I think in some circles I'm in, I'm hearing a lot of that. I've been hearing a lot of that. People feeling like either too little, too late, or that these are just sort of superficial efforts, but what's really the, sort of at the institutional level, what's the policy behind it? Also, you've talked about the money, but what's also the policy, which is connected to money, obviously, and what are the actual actions that are happening that do anti-racist work. So can we delve a little bit more into whether the skepticism is, maybe you've all said that there are victories here and this is all real important stuff that's happening. Is there simultaneous, is it still worthwhile for us to have some skepticism alongside of that? And so can we talk a little bit more about that? Marcia, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the skepticism is healthy, right? Because that's what fuels the terms of accountability. I mean, many of us know that after the summer, there was this incredible desire to hear Black voices, but not compensate them or to change behavior. And so I think, we have actually a strong 50-year record of some of the dangers of this type of engagement, because in many ways 2020 was 68 in so many ways, except for, I will say, what Bianca points out is that, like, we never had all 50 states in mass movement for racial justice, and we never had the kind of racial diversity and abolition conversation. Those are really strong things. But I think that what happens is that, how do we really kind of restructure the ask and the accountability in light of 50 years of a kind of diversity and inclusion model that doesn't get us to that next place, right? And so I think one of the things that we find with institutions is that you see the responses have nothing to do with the critical problem. So opening more Black businesses, having more Black executives on boards and C-suites, giving people like me an opportunity to write something, that actually doesn't save George Floyd's life, right? Like, it doesn't. And as much as representation is important kind of, strategy, we never get to the origins of why people are screaming out in the first place. And so I think that our skepticism forces us to return to the origins, right? And so I think that this is what I always advise against. Everyone wants to have an anti-racist institution. Is everyone ready to sell property and make reparations? Is everyone ready for universal health care and free college? So the terms of the conversation have to constantly be pushed to actually where the work can animate and change people's lives.
Mm-hmm. Roz?
So I have a total agreement here. I think the skepticism is absolutely necessary, and it does have to be connected to accountability. So as we are looking that these, especially as we look at the statements that are made by corporations and by politicians, we do have to follow the money, because if you look at people making statements and where they're given money, it's not, it doesn't match. And so you've got full page ads in the New York Times from these corporations, Amazon included, that profess to that Black Lives Matter, and they squash Black lives every day in every way they can, both physically at work, denying adequate wages. And even if you were paying $15.01, which is what Amazon does pay, that's not enough. And if you're killing people on the job, if you're killing their communities, like in Bessemer, if you're really just choking people, but at the same time making proclamations and giving a very small amount of your earnings to civil rights groups, that's not sufficient. And we have to raise questions there. And we cannot be lulled into not raising questions and not supporting efforts that push them, even though they're making these declarations. And so I think that skepticism is important. And while we're being skeptical, we need to make sure that we are part of changing the narrative around that we are doing the education as we talk about it. And then the last thing I'll raise up is that in terms of the politicians, we're talking about systemic racism, structural racism that's embedded in this economic system as well and in our policies. And so when a politician says, I support Black lives, what are your policies? That's what we have to go with them. And then another place where there's some skepticism that I carry that I really try to deal with is this whole question of allyship. I really want to move people who are trying to figure this out and thinking hard about it to a place from allyship to co-conspiratorship. I want people to be in this with me, be in this with Black folks, be in this with people of color who are suffering. So so this is kind of the ball of my skepticism right now.
Okay. Bianca, I know you've written about, speaking about institutions, I know you've written about universities and activism around some related questions. So we're starting to go towards questions. I mean, and what I'm hearing from you all is we need to start pushing. We need to kind of push these corporations and institutions around policy and money and these sorts of questions. And then also about this idea of being skeptical. So based on the work that you've been doing, especially related to universities, what are your thoughts related to that?
So I know, I remember when all the statements were being released, I was thinking, I wonder how many Black people at their higher ed institutions are exhausted by the labor they had to put in to help create these statements. So we, my co-editors and I, Frank Tua and Dean Squire, just finished publishing a book called Plantation Politics and Campus Rebellions, talking about the various student protests that have happened over the past 5 years on campuses and how Black students in particular on these college campuses have been demanding and trying to hold their universities accountable to the promises that they're making in their mission statements and their curricula, et cetera, and how the extraction of Black people's labor at the same time that universities feel the need to put us on, pamphlets and websites and declare that they are diverse actually wears us down. And so I think institutions like higher ed have a real role to play in this change and in this work. But again, they have to learn how to do these things differently than they've been doing. And so what we saw was we looked at the student demands from student protests from the 1960s and 70s to today, and almost to the T, the demands were exactly the same. More Black faculty, more money for, different types of curricula on campus, more programming, all the things. The only difference that really stood out was that students in this moment were demanding for more resources for mental health resources and for culturally responsive, responsible mental health resources. So that was, students are becoming aware of identities and wellness and like the cost, the psychological cost of racism in their lives. So for me, I always say to higher institutions, show me the Black women on your campus and let me talk to them and see how they feel in this environment. And I'll tell you whether or not your institution is anti-racist and feminist. They need to place their money to create Black centered spaces on campus. And I don't mean only the Black Cultural Center on campus, but how are you investing resources to allow the Black folks in your home community to do deep thinking, deep writing, to do organizing? How are you supporting that within your institution and within the community surrounding your institution? If you're not allowing Black folks to trust the folks who are doing the work on your campus, to trust the people who have been calling for cultural change and different types of institutional change, then you're actually not doing the work. You can't prescribe the way that your institution needs to change if you're not listening to the Black folks on your campus. So for me, I look at where institutions are investing not only in programming, but in the people who are seen as the troublemakers and rabble rousers on their campus. How are they being resourced to actually make change? Radical change doesn't come from doing things the way we've always done them. If you say to me, that's just not how we do it, then usually that's a sign that you're not ready to make the change that you say and declaring that you're ready to make.
Mhm. Thank you. Marsha, I know you've done some work at your own university relatedly. Do you have any thoughts on this question of higher ed and these sorts of issues?
Yeah, I think the recent conversations about universities and slavery, as well as universities of certain universities being memorials to the Confederacy, has helped in understanding that we can't always assume the university is benevolent and positive just because it's a place of learning. And I think that that has been such a critical intervention in holding universities accountable, because there's this very interesting way that like in Davarian Baldwin's new book about universities, where he talks about the gentrification, the displacement, and the policing that universities have initiated, and how they kind of operate in plain sight. And so when we look at a Starbucks and we say, oh, that's a sign of gentrification, or we look at the luxury condos, but we don't look at the university hospitals, we don't look at the urban extension campuses, we don't kind of rope them into these entities, I think to our own peril. But all of this is to say that universities are really fascinating because they often are the microcosm in which people can point to pushing for a certain kind of racial justice agenda, while also kind of hiding behind a stereotype that they're progressive, while most of their policies are deeply regressive towards the very things that are being demanded, but they make concessions in a way for people to kind of look at. And so, I think that I'm really happy to see that the university is being taken to task, not just by students, but by the nefarious impact they have on workers, on descendants of slavery, on all sorts of entities who are also very much part of that community, even if they don't attend there or work there.
Mhm, mhm. Let's also talk about, Roz, you said you wanted to talk more about corporations. So I wonder if there's more that you want to say about the work that you've been doing, because this might be also a moment to transition and think about what activists are doing. All of you have an activist background in various ways, and love to hear about some of the work that's being done to address these kinds of questions, get the real substance of this work being done.
Yeah. So, organizing in the middle of this reckoning, it's really been an amazing thing to watch, coupled with it, to be in, coupled with a pandemic, coupled with an economic crisis. So it's been a very interesting thing to be in and to still fight. And in some ways, because the contradictions are so high, it's almost easier to make a case for what's really happening. The corporations have figured out that the right things to say and figured out the wrong things to do. So I work with the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. It's a continuation in some ways of the work of Dr. King, but in many ways different. But has as its central point racism, while we're talking about economic poverty, while we're talking about ecological devastation, militarism. There's an understanding that race is at the center of all those things, and that's where the penetration point is in our work. And these corporations have just been terrible. And so we're seeing them exposed every day, but I think we have to really make sure that people are, that we are part of the education that needs to happen around this. Because if we're not, then we don't take advantage of kind of the mood in the country and the opportunity to provide clarity. And I think we can do that. I think we all have to be drawing attention to the big companies, the Amazons, the McDonald's that declared their workers essential, gave them pins that said you're great and you're essential, and then don't pay them wages, as essential workers. Don't allow them to go home when they're sick. This is what these corporations who have a lot of Black workers, this is what their actions. So I think not only is the skepticism necessary, but it's necessary to take them to task. Our communities are full of a lot of these corporations. Many of these corporations place themselves in low wage, Black and other people of color communities purposefully. And so these statements that they're making really have to be taken on.
Okay. I do want to remind the audience that we're open to your questions, so please remember to write your questions into the Q&A function and we'll be able to take them and bring them to the panelists. Marcia, did you want to, since she brought up McDonald's, do you want to say anything? Because I think there's obviously a lot to say about McDonald's. Would you like to jump in here and say something both about, the critique of McDonald's that Roz is offering, but also you have some nuanced historical work on McDonald's.
Yeah, one of the things that I talk about in my book is that, McDonald's became the McDonald's we know in Black communities because of a moment a lot like this. And so in 1968, after King's assassination, the Nixon administration was giving a lot of money for Black capitalism, Black business ownership, and people were thinking, okay, maybe we can create some Black economic self-determination. And what they found was that money wasn't going to the local bookstore or the Black owned cafe or manufacturing outfit. It was going to fast food franchising. And a lot of it went to put McDonald's in Black communities. And so one of the things I think is really interesting in looking at McDonald's 2020, the same questions emerge about ownership, about workers, about what does it mean to build up Black wealth. And one of the dangers, I think, of this moment is that corporations like McDonald's will say things like, we'll make more Black millionaires with our franchises, or we will hire more, Black advertising agencies to make sure, they're putting ads during Black programming and on Twitter. But it never again gets to the heart of it. People didn't go out on the streets in 68 because they wanted to be a vice president for diversity, and people weren't struggling so they could own a franchise. It's the things that people are still asking for: decent housing, good schools for their kids, some type of income guarantee. You want to be able to get sick and not lose everything you have. Again, those questions are unresolved, but the bait and switch is so powerful. And I think for many of us, it's also poignant because we want to see Black people doing well. We want to see Black people achieving, but the question is at what expense and at what price? And I think this is where the corporation is able to kind of suppress those questions, because we're often locked into, at least it's jobs in our community, at least it's something. And fighting against those urges is really, really hard.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We have some related questions in the chat, so I'm going to pull some of them up. One person asked, how should we take corporations to task and hold them to accountability? Should we have boycotts and hit them in their wallets? Bianca, you want to jump in? Thoughts on that one?
I'm not sure I'm the best to answer that question.
That's okay.
I mean, I think maybe other panelists probably have more to say about that. I think boycotts are fine, but what I've learned over the past few years in organizing is that boycotting without a goal or a particular tangible objective can be exhausting. And so I guess we would have to be clear about what we want from these corporations. What are we boycotting them to do? And what sticks out to me in this moment, we're talking about skepticism, but I was also thinking about the victories of this moment, is mutual aid. And mutual aid is not going to be the thing that takes care of us for forever. I mean, if we're not earning a living wage, if we're not earning wages that allow us to provide for communities, that's a problem. But what I did see in the past couple of years was the ways that people are gathering the resources that they have in their community, whether they be financial or emotional or caring resources, and really taking care of one another. And I saw someone in a Q&A talk about policing of communities. we have a long way until we get to abolition, right? That's going to be a long fight. But what I have appreciated and what has made me feel victorious in this moment are the ways that Black folks are figuring out ways to take care of one another psychologically, mentally, and physically in the face of extreme violence. And that's what there's been a huge, whether it's just the mainstream attention to it, whether we can see it more because we have technology where we can see GoFundMe accounts and all these things, and not that GoFundMe is the answer, but that we can gather resources quicker and from more places than we could before. The mutual aid and the ways that people have just found methods to care for one another has been the victory. But that's not a long-term strategy. So I would love to hear what other people think about boycotting corporations.
Roz, you have a lot of experience in this area. Talk to us about how we hold corporations accountable, whether boycotts are the way or other ways you can think of.
I think Bianca's points about boycotting are serious and the right points, the right way to think about a boycott, because they're hard to win, they're hard to measure. And when we call for them, we need to know how we can win. I mean, that's part of this, the strategy when we're taking systems to task, is to have a strategy for winning. We don't always win, but if we have a strategy for winning, we can win or get close to a win. The other part of a boycott has to do with also some consulting with the folks who work in places like that. Just to make sure that the messaging is right and the strategy is parallel, that they run together so that we're not working at cross purposes. And so I think that's an important matter. So, and it's always in terms of taking companies to task and institutions to task. I think it's always important to do our homework. And Bianca talked about that some. But to understand what it is we're fighting and then having the fight match that so that we are in a position to win. I just want to say something about Bianca's helping me bring me back to the victories. What we can claim now, because I've been in this struggle for social justice for a very long time, over 5 decades. And so there are many victories that we have to claim. There have been some stepping back, but there are so many moments and victories in this time that we have to appreciate, including, to me, one of the biggest ones is two. One is of the people who've come forward on this in this moment, 50 states, people are saying up to 15 million people have been involved in this particular struggle. But the other thing is that there's a deeper understanding of the systemic nature of racism and where it comes from and how it's connected to the very system we live under. And so I think that's also to be celebrated. So I'm glad you brought us back to, okay, these are hard times and challenging, and there are things we have to celebrate. And if we don't celebrate, we can't keep going.
I will say that I appreciate those comments as well, because I do think, if you have a list of things you want and you don't get everything, you can still acknowledge that you have success in getting X, Y, and Z. And I think that just becomes important, one, for morale, I would imagine, for morale in your activism, but also just to acknowledge that the work, you've done some work and it has produced something, even if it hasn't produced all the things that you're interested in. There's another comment here that's related. How should we hold local elected officials accountable in economic justice? Is there a different approach for corporations than for elected officials? Anybody want to jump in on that? Marcia?
Well,
Roz, go ahead. Sure, Roz, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say one thing. And I think that for them, it has to be their record and policies.
Okay.
Doesn't matter what they say. It's what bill did you sponsor and push for? Not just sponsor, because people will sponsor a lot of stuff, but it's like what was your role in actually moving that bill? How much did you bring in the voices of people that you represent? So that's all I would say about that, is look at their record and their policies.
Mhm. What do you all think it takes to have effective community level anti-racist work, especially in thinking about the suburban white communities where those lawn signs are really proliferating more than other places? Is anti-racist work in these communities useful towards the larger anti-racist struggle? I know in my, well, go ahead, Marcia, you can jump
No, go
right
ahead.
in. No, go, you go ahead.
This is a really tough one because, gosh, you want people to embrace the possibility that the way that our society is structured is not inevitable, and you want people to move closer to the idea of what can be changed. I guess my question is, what people imagine the kind of end goal is and what they think it will require from them. And this is where I think things get really, really difficult, because we see that not only in the political sphere, but in the kind of community engagement sphere, the hyper reaction to any kind of change. So it's like a school has Martin Luther King Day and everyone collapses under the weight of the possibility of it. There's some type of initiative to, distribute seats in schools in New York City, and people just collapse under the weight of it. And so I guess my question, fundamentally is, what paradigm are people imagining if they think that they're moving towards an anti-racist world? And I'm always curious what they think it looks and feels like and what it requires of them. And I think this is sometimes what's missing from the deep desire to be on the bandwagon, right? People want to read books. They want to think that they can be kind to their neighbors. But I always wonder, so what are you willing to give up? Like what can be taken away from you, and you get, this doesn't happen for you in order for other things to happen for others. And I don't know if there has really been a conscientious call for that kind of self-reflection. And so, it always turns up a little bit short. And it's also very aggressive when it's pushed in that direction, that kind of, wellspring of a deep desire to be part of a movement, but not really understanding that movements cost everyone, not just the folks who are at the lead.
Mhm. Bianca, you're nodding your head.
Oh my gosh, I could spend all day thinking about this one. Again, so I organized in a city, originally, in Denver, which is a predominantly white city, and in Boulder, which is like 1.3% Black. So, we were organizing with white folks. That's kind of what we had to do in the context. So I think context is really important, right? Like, where are you? What are the different populations that are doing organizing work? And we found ourselves really building various forms of solidarity with showing up for racial justice, which is Surge, in Colorado, in the Denver and Boulder chapter, because not only because we had to, but we had to, right? Like, those are the white folks that were doing the work. And so we had to sit down at a table and decide what were people's responsibilities, organizational responsibilities, right? Boulder being a predominantly white space where there were a lot of suburban white folks who were coming into their, anti-racist consciousness. Well, then that chapter was responsible for educating those folks and teaching them how to do organizing where Black folks are at the lead, right? Denver was a more multiracial space. And so the white folks in that community, the white folks in Surge, we asked them to be the buffers between us and police on a regular basis, right? So that we weren't putting our bodies on the line always. So there were, I think, strategy and sitting down and being able to create trust across difference and within solidarity is really important. And that takes work. That's about process. That's about years of relationship building. And I think sometimes people see people marching in the streets and they're like, I can go do that. And then that's it. Like, all the real work is in the process, is in the everyday victories and losses, where you have to be willing, everyone, regardless of their positionality, has to be willing to fail and be able to be held accountable for their failures. And for me, again, seeing masses of white folks ready to scream Black Lives Matter is great stuff. And I know that that question about risk, and I say it all the time to white folks, what are you willing to risk? And not even willing, like, how are you being called in around this? What are you losing? If you can't tell me what you have lost in the past 5 years around this work, then you're not doing enough. Because I know when I get in the streets and police are in riot gear, my life is on the line and yours isn't, not in the same way. So I'm risking every day in particular ways. And if you can't name the risk for me, not like you lost your little friends who live next door, or, you know, you were uncomfortable in this moment and so you had white tears, like, what money are you losing? What real costs are there to this work? If you can't name that and you can't feel that, then you're probably not doing the work as hard as you think you can, or as hard as you think you are.
Roz, what are your thoughts on this one?
Well, my sisters on this panel have laid it out pretty clearly. I don't think I have much more to add. I think that we have to tell folks the truth. I mean, it goes to what I just heard from both Marsha and Bianca about what needs to happen and where they fit and what roles people can play. And I don't think that we have to, it's not our role to educate, white folks on all the problems and pieces of oppression. It is necessary for us to tell them the truth about our oppression and how they are oppressed by allowing this system. Because I think sometimes that's not clear to them, especially poor folks who are poor and low wealth who are not, who are coming to this movement. So I just totally agree. I don't have much more.
Okay.
Can I just say one thing?
Absolutely.
I'm about to wrap up. It was playing in my head is Marsha's point in the beginning about what types of change allow Black people kind of to live and survive, and what types of change are about making it a bit more comfortable for us, right? So like, it's nice that I'll be able, if my university decides to give me resources and time to write books, wonderful, but that's not going to save George Floyd or myself from being killed, right? And I was thinking about this question of boycotting corporations, which I think, again, if we have goals, is really useful. But this divestment from police forces and militarized police forces is really, for me, where we could spend some time thinking and doing some organizing, because divesting from police forces and allowing those resources to go in other places that would keep us well and protected from that violence is the type of change that might allow some of us to walk these streets and live a lot longer. And I wanted to name that because I think, again, white supremacy is a huge ball of issues, and there's a lot of locations where we can press on to make change. But this question of police violence is something that, because there's so many places to make change, sometimes we lose our eye on that ball. And that's the one that's actually, those stories of people getting killed and the families that are going through the pain and suffering and grief, and as a community, the pain and suffering and grief that we experience when we bear witness to this violence, that's where the real change is. And so I know the police question is hard. I know that violence question is hard, but I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that that is actually what is bringing us to this table to talk about all the other things that are violent that we're experiencing.
I'm glad you brought that up, actually. This is a point for me to remind people that in the afternoon, we actually do have a panel on policing in prisons. So I would encourage people who really want to delve more deeply into this topic to also visit that panel. We also have a panel later this afternoon related to corporations specifically and anti-racism and some of the statements that we're talking about. So there's lots of ways to be able to continue to delve into these questions. And I'll just say quickly that one thing that we've seen across this conference is all the panels intersect. I mean, in ways that sometimes we couldn't even have imagined, but just the discussions really intersect and overlap a lot, which is really makes, I think, and sort of enriches the larger program. Let me pull a couple more questions that we have that are mounting in the Q&A session, in the Q&A section. Roz, this is for you. What has the challenge been like for the Poor People's Campaign to transition for COVID, Zooming, and caravanning? You're on mute, Roz.
It has not been easy. It's been a big challenge, especially since we were not prepared for this for the technology. However, we have really gone to great limits because it's the only way we could continue to organize. We've gone to great limits to great extents to try to overcome that. And so we continue our work. I mean, we continue to target state governments that are passing oppressive laws, doing voter suppression. We continue to target federal Mitch McConnell and all the folks who are doing harm and watching coups happen and not do anything about it. But so we're still doing our work. An example, we had planned a large gathering in Washington, D.C. in June, and we had to shift that to online. And we had on one platform alone 2.7 million people. And so in some ways we're able to reach more people and we are growing. So we've got work in 45 states now. We are with committees and people doing the work. And so, so it's been a challenge, but the issues have been so compelling. And I believe the strategy of the Poor People's Campaign is also compelling as it deals with fusion politics, you know, bringing everybody in but not missing the fact that race is at the central to the work. We really are growing. And so it's been difficult technically, but people have been drawn to this campaign, and we want to remain accountable to our mission and to our vision, and we want to be held accountable to that even in this period. So today we're in Bessemer, Alabama, at 3 o'clock with the Amazon workers, and we're doing part online, and you know, Reverend Barbara's down there, you know, after vaccine in person with workers. So we're really continuing the fight.
Great. We have two questions that I'm going to connect because I think they're related. They're generally questions about holding the BLM leadership accountable when there are folks who are either complicit in the spaces of leveraging the movement for their own promotion, or that some of the messaging gets diluted or co-opted when it's used by celebrity activism and things like that. So thinking about folks who take up the mantle of BLM, I mean, it's a little bit related to the use of the statements, but also some of the Black leadership that may have self-promotion as a motivation more than real substantive work. Any thoughts on that, those questions? Marcia?
This one is so hard because this is why I think multi-generational, intergenerational leadership and structure is so important, because elders are not just there for institutional memory or for interesting stories. They can sometimes help people see around corners that they can't quite see. I say this because, you know, this is not new, but the opportunity for these dynamics to be exposed is probably greater than it was in the past. People fought about money and access and attention in all of the great movements. This does not need to necessarily collapse or imperil a movement, but there has to be a structure in which there has to be clarity and understanding about what does it mean to operate responsibly in a context that looks for co-optation and celebrity making. And at the same time, I know a number of people who have committed themselves to full-time organizing. They need to eat. They have families and communities to take care of. They need access to healthcare. So what is a kind of ethical and responsible place for us to value the labor of all people, and at the same time understand that the selling of movements is not necessarily a business that is the most ethical direction to go in. This is really hard. You know, the $90 million story about BLM, I'm sure there are levels to that. And I think we have to be very careful to say, $90 million, where'd that money go? Let's take a step back and say, you know, the routes to funding organizations is complex and has many heads. But I think at the heart of it is, what are we naming as betrayal? Is the fact that people had money, they had access to power. This is, I mean, this one is so hard because I think it's very easy to identify places where we feel like people are being disingenuous. But I think it's also hard for us to have a vision of what we consider ethical or fair or right. And I think we need to spend as much time on both of those questions, because we can say, well, we don't feel like this is right, but then what do we think is actually responsible, you know, procedure in a movement? And this one, whew, this one's hard. This one's really hard.
Bianca, I'm going to let you weigh in on this. We are running out of time, so these will be your final comments for both of you, and then I'll turn to you, Roz.
I have, as a chartered member, as a person who was in a chartered chapter and who was co-founder, I have a lot of thoughts about this question. Some of the things that I'll say publicly, because I do believe that some of these conversations should happen in community with folks. I think that this is where relationships are really important, and part of the biggest critique. And again, I will say that I'm no longer with my chapter in Denver, so I don't speak for them, while I very much support their thoughts, because they're one of the chapters that they're part of the BLM 10, who have been very vocal about how they felt maybe abandoned or not supported by the national network's leadership. So I'll just say that relationships are really important. And when you have autonomous chapters working with a global network and leadership that are known by so many, and there's a gap between that, what some people who were outside of that moment experience don't understand is when you're in the face of urgency and police violence, and you grow bigger than you expect to in a moment, and infrastructure is not the real focus in the moment because there are so many things happening, it can be really easy for this thing that we're watching right now to happen. And it's happened in previous movements. So I echo this idea of, like, I guess my question would be, where are the spaces where we, like the Poor People's Campaign, where do we have the spaces to think about these resources in moments where there are lulls, maybe in activism, to foresee how to build the infrastructure? Because infrastructure is part of what the major issue is right now. The other thing I'll say is that I really do believe, and again, we can critique leadership, all the leadership in a variety of ways, but there is something about the gender of these folks and the fact that this organization was started and centers Black women, Black queer women, and Black queer folks, that I think fuels some of the critique that is in here. And so if we look at corporations and organizations, long-term ones that are dedicated to Black folks, that are dedicated to equity and justice, but that have not done a great job at being accountable to the people, generally the fact that those organizations have been run by white folks, by Black men, by cis hetero folks, they don't receive the same visceral and vitriol critique that this organization has received. And so it's very complex. And I have a lot of feelings about it, but I would hope that folks would get involved to be able to see these barriers and these obstacles coming, and that we would prepare better for them in the future.
Great. And Roz, last comment. You're on mute.
I mean, Marcia and Bianca have really had the best words I've heard on this particular issue. I mean, it's a thoughtful way that they've presented. I don't have much more to add there. This whole question of how do we, in periods of lull, prepare ourselves for leadership is really a critical question. And I don't know the answer to it, but we have to do that. I remember being in, as we engage in movements, And movements have, as everybody knows, ebbs and flows. And when we're in ebbs and still continuing to fight and still continuing our work, how is it that we are taking on all these questions? I think that's important. I remember being in I remember talking to a young activist not that long ago who said to me, talking about leadership, he said, I'm an accidental leader, not prepared. And I think what we need to do is to, when these leaders arise and those of us who have anything to offer, we ought to offer them. That ought to be part of what some of us do who've been around, not to replace, not to squash, but also just to be there to support. And I think that's the role of people like me in these movements, to bring whatever we can in support of movements, not to necessarily pass the baton at every point, but to run with people as we seek victories in this country.
Well, thank you. We are over time and so out of time, but I do want to thank all three of you for a really terrific conversation. It was nice to have you exchange among yourselves and contribute to this really current topic. For those of you in the audience, also thank you for joining us. If you want to continue this conversation, please head over to the collab session, which is happening in 5 minutes. You should have the link from your registration list this morning that you received by email, and we'll continue the conversation, be able to connect with others on these topics. So thank you once again, and we'll see you at future sessions for the rest of the week. Thank you.